They laughed at a widow's stone shield over the cabin, until the blizzard crushed every other roof. "You're going to cave your own roof in before the first snowflake even falls, Sofia," Marcus shouted, his laughter echoing across the crisp autumn valley. A few other neighbors leaned against his pickup, chuckling as they watched the widow hoist another heavy river stone up the wooden scaffolding. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow, her hands bleeding from the mortar. "Arthur said the pitched roofs won't hold the weight this year," she replied, her voice trembling but resolute. "He left the designs. The stone shield will disperse the pressure." "Arthur was a fool who chased ghosts in the clouds," Marcus scoffed, turning away. "When that rock pile crushes your cabin, don't come crying to us." The autumn wind sweeping through the valley carried the distinct, bitter scent of pine needles and impending frost, a sensory reminder that time was running out. Sofia stood at the base of her small timber cabin, staring up at the bizarre, swelling anomaly that had consumed the last 6 months of her life. While every other home in the prosperous, gentrifying mountain town boasted picturesque, steeply pitched roofs adorned with cedar shingles or sleek metal siding, Sofia's home was slowly being entombed beneath a massive, curved carapace of solid river rock. It looked like the shell of a prehistoric tortoise, low to the ground, aggressively rounded, and incredibly heavy. To the untrained eye, it was an architectural nightmare. To the townspeople, it was the tragic, public unraveling of a grieving widow's sanity. But to Sofia, it was the absolute gospel truth left behind by the man she loved. Arthur had been a structural engineer, a man who spoke in the language of load-bearing vectors, shear strength, and meteorological physics. He had not been a paranoid man, but he had been a profoundly observant one. Before his heart gave out last winter, collapsing while desperately trying to shore up the town's old wooden community hall during what everyone else called a routine flurry, he had spent 3 years meticulously mapping the shifting microclimates of their isolated valley. He had discovered a terrifying pattern. The surrounding mountains were acting as a thermal funnel, altering the barometric pressure and wind shear. The town was no longer facing standard snowfalls. It was positioned perfectly for an atmospheric compression event. When the right combination of moisture and Arctic air collided, the valley would not just get snow. It would be buried under thousands of tons of high-density, wet concrete snow, driven by hurricane-force downward drafts. Sofia remembered the night he had first drafted the blueprints for the stone shield. The warm glow of the desk lamp had illuminated the frantic, brilliant lines of his pencil. He had explained that traditional pitched roofs, designed to shed light, powdery snow, would act like sails against the sheer downward force of the wind he was predicting. The wind would catch the steep angles, creating a vacuum effect on the leeward side, while simultaneously crushing the windward side. The roofs would snap like dry kindling under the compound pressure. The only defense, Arthur had theorized, was a low-profile aerodynamic dome of high thermal mass. A stone shield. The curved surface would force the wind to glide over the structure, utilizing the gale itself to continuously sweep the heavy snow off the rounded peak, while the immense weight of the interlocking stones, counterintuitively, anchored the walls against the lateral shear. Every day since the ground had thawed in April, Sofia had driven her battered truck down to the valley floor, hauling up round, smooth granite stones polished by the ancient river. She had taught herself how to mix the specialized, flexible polymer mortar Arthur had specified in his notes. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused, split, and permanently stained grey from the cement. Her shoulders ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that made sleep nearly impossible, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the agonizing void Arthur's death had left in her home. Every stone she mortared into place felt like a conversation with him, a defiant act of love and trust in a town that had branded him a crackpot. The mockery from the community was relentless. Marcus, who lived in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar A-frame chalet just down the ridge, was the most vocal. He represented the new wave of valley residents, wealthy, aesthetic-driven, and completely disconnected from the brutal realities of nature. He had led the town council in stripping Arthur of his consulting contracts after Arthur presented his doomsday climate models. Now, Marcus viewed Sofia's construction as an eyesore, a blight on the neighborhood's property values. "It's a hazard, Sofia," Elias, another neighbor, had told her just last week while walking his purebred dogs past her property. "You're stacking tons of dead weight on a frame that wasn't built for it. When the snow comes, that whole pile of rubble is going to collapse straight into your living room. You're building your own tomb." Sofia had simply tightened her grip on her trowel, applying another thick layer of mortar. "The internal load-bearing pillars are reinforced with steel bracing," she had answered quietly, reciting Arthur's specifications from memory. "The weight is distributed down to the bedrock foundation, not the walls." Elias had rolled his eyes, muttered something about municipal zoning violations, and walked away. They simply could not understand. They looked at their towering, sharp-angled roofs and saw strength, tradition, and beauty. Sofia looked at them and saw fragile glass sails waiting for a hurricane. She knew that arguing was pointless. The blueprints sitting on her dining room table were dense with equations that she barely understood herself, but she trusted the man who had written them. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the western range, casting long, chilling shadows across her yard, Sofia lifted the final keystone. It was a perfectly round piece of granite, heavy enough to make her breath catch in her throat as she maneuvered it up the scaffolding. She nestled it into the apex of the dome, slathering it with the last bucket of mortar. She smoothed the joints with a wet sponge, stepping back to survey her work. The shield was complete. It was a bizarre, alien-looking structure, a grey mound of smooth stones squatting defiantly over the wooden bones of her cabin. It possessed none of the elegant charm of the neighboring chalets, but as a sudden, sharp gust of evening wind swept down from the peaks, Sofia watched as the current of air seamlessly hugged the curved stones, wrapping around the dome without creating a single rattle or draft in the timber below. She climbed down the scaffolding, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. She walked into her home, locking the heavy wooden door behind her. The interior was remarkably silent. The stones had already begun to insulate the cabin, muffling the sounds of the outside world. Sofia walked over to the dining table, resting her bruised hands flat against the worn blueprints. "It's done, Arthur," she whispered to the empty room, a single tear cutting a clean path through the grey dust on her cheek. "I built it exactly like you said. I'm ready." Outside, the temperature plummeted dramatically, and the first heavy, wet flake of snow fell silently against the valley floor. The transition from autumn to winter in the valley was usually a gradual, beautiful descent into hibernation. But this year, it felt like an ambush. By mid-November, the sky above the mountain range had not cleared for 2 weeks. It hung low and oppressive, a bruised, swirling canopy of charcoal and violent purple. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that the local dogs howled at all hours, their instincts warning them of an atmospheric shift their owners couldn't perceive. On the local radio stations, the meteorologists sounded increasingly bewildered. They spoke of a bifurcated Arctic front and an unprecedented moisture funnel creeping up from the southern coast, on a direct collision course with a stagnant, freezing pressure ridge sitting directly over the valley. Despite the ominous forecasts, the town's preparations remained stubbornly casual. In the aisles of the local grocer, the atmosphere was almost festive. People were stocking up on artisan cheeses, expensive red wines, and extra firewood for cozy nights by the hearth. To them, a massive snowstorm was merely an excuse for a long weekend indoors, a beautiful white backdrop for their floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows. They trusted the architecture of their homes unconditionally. After all, the steep A-frames and Victorian gables had been the standard in the mountains for over a century. Why would this winter be any different? Sofia navigated the crowded aisles like a ghost. She wasn't buying wine. She was buying emergency rations, dry rice, canned beans, bottled water, and dozens of thick, slow-burning candles. She felt a sickening knot of dread twisting in her stomach. She watched her neighbors laughing, their shopping carts filled with luxuries, entirely oblivious to the physics of the impending disaster. She wanted to scream at them. She wanted to stand on a checkout counter and beg them to look at Arthur's math, to reinforce their trusses, to abandon their upper floors and sleep in their basements. But she knew the futility of it. They had already dismissed her as the crazy widow building a rock pile. Any warning from her would only provide them with more entertainment. As she loaded her supplies into her truck, Marcus pulled up in his sleek, heavy-duty SUV. He rolled down his window, warm air blasting from the luxury interior. "Stocking up for the apocalypse, Sofia?" he asked, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "The weather service is calling for 4 feet. Your little rock pile is going to be buried by morning. You sure you don't want to come stay with us? We have a guest room on the 3rd floor. Great views of the storm." Sofia gripped the cold metal of her truck door, her knuckles turning white. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, at his smug confidence, his absolute faith in his expensive, fragile house. 4 feet of powder is one thing, Marcus, she said, her voice eerily calm. But the pressure is dropping too fast. It's going to pull moisture from the coast. It's going to be wet snow, driven by cyclonic winds. Your roof pitches are too steep. They're going to act like a parachute. Marcus laughed out loud, shaking his head. "Still reading Arthur's science fiction, I see. My house was designed by an award-winning architect, Sofia. It can handle a breeze. You just worry about your ceiling not crushing you in your sleep." He rolled up his window and sped off into the darkening afternoon. Sofia drove back to her isolated cabin on the ridge. The air outside was growing thick, biting at her skin with a feral intensity. She spent the final hours of daylight conducting a meticulous inspection of her home. She checked the heavy steel cross-bracing she and Arthur had installed before his death, ensuring the bolts were tight. She checked the seals around her windows. She brought in massive stacks of firewood, stacking them high against the interior walls. By the time darkness fell, the cabin was a fortress. At 8 p.m. the storm arrived, and it did not begin with a gentle flurry. It began with an explosion. A wall of wind slammed into the valley with the force of a freight train. Inside the cabin, Sofia flinched as the initial shockwave hit. But then, something miraculous happened. Instead of the violent shuddering and terrifying groans of timber she was used to experiencing during winter storms, the cabin remained entirely still. The wind howled, a deafening, demonic shriek, but the sound was oddly deflected. Sofia realized the aerodynamic curve of the stone shield was working. The wind was hitting the base of the rocks and being forced upward, gliding smoothly over the dome. The tremendous lateral force that should have been ripping at her siding was being neutralized by the shape and the sheer, immovable weight of the granite. Then came the snow. It was not the light, romantic powder of Christmas cards. It was a torrential downpour of heavy, slushy, super-cooled water that froze the instant it made contact. It slapped against the windows like wet cement. The temperature outside plummeted to 20 below zero, but the friction of the wind kept the storm moving at a terrifying velocity. Sophia sat in her armchair by the wood stove, clutching a mug of tea with shaking hands. The fire popped and hissed, casting warm, dancing shadows across the exposed wooden beams of her ceiling. The contrast between the violent chaos outside and the absolute, unshakable sanctuary inside was deeply disorienting. She could hear the snow accumulating, thousands of pounds of weight dropping from the black sky. But she could also hear the wind sweeping across the curved roof, acting as an invisible broom, continuously shearing the heaviest snow loads off the smooth stone surface and dumping it harmlessly onto the ground around the foundation. Arthur's math was flawless. The shield was alive, breathing with the storm, using the enemy's own strength to protect the cabin. But as Sophia sat in the warmth, her relief was suddenly swallowed by a cold, paralyzing terror. If Arthur's calculations about the shield were right, then his calculations about the rest of the town were also right. Around midnight, over the screaming roar of the blizzard, Sophia heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a deep, resonant crack that echoed across the valley, sharp as a cannon shot. It was the sound of massive, structural timber snapping under impossible tension. The slaughter of the valley had begun. The night stretched into a surreal, agonizing eternity. The blizzard did not wane. It intensified, feeding on the trapped pressure within the valley basin. Inside her stone cocoon, Sophia paced the length of her small living room, the wood floors warm beneath her wool socks. The air inside was still and safe, smelling of cedarwood and herbal tea, a stark, almost cruel juxtaposition to the apocalyptic violence raging just inches beyond her walls. The stone shield was performing a masterful symphony of physics. She could feel the faint, rhythmic vibrations traveling down the steel support columns as tons of wet, dense snow were deflected off the aerodynamic curve. The structure wasn't just surviving, it was indifferent to the storm, but the psychological torture lay in what she could hear happening outside. At 1:15 a.m., the second sound reached her. It wasn't a clean snap this time. It was a prolonged, excruciating groan of tortured wood, followed by a thunderous, explosive collapse that rattled the teacups in her cupboards. It came from the direction of the wealthy enclave down the ridge. Sophia rushed to her front window, wiping the condensation from the glass, but there was nothing to see. The world outside was a swirling, opaque void of violent white. Visibility was zero. The wind was moving so fast it looked like a solid wall of static. She knew exactly what was happening. In her mind's eye, she could see Arthur's blueprints, the red-inked diagrams showing the failure points of traditional architecture. The wet snow was acting like a sponge, freezing and accumulating on the steep, angled roofs. The shingles, designed to shed light powder, provided too much friction for the heavy sludge. As the weight grew exponentially, the hurricane-force winds hit the broad sides of those high-pitched roofs. The combination of the sheer downward mass of the snow and the immense lateral pressure of the wind was creating a fulcrum effect. The ridge beams, the very spines of those beautiful, multi-million-dollar chalets, were bowing, splintering, and ultimately surrendering. At 3 a.m., the power grid failed. The faint ambient glow from the valley floor vanished instantly, plunging the world into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Sophia's cabin was illuminated only by the frantic, flickering orange light of the wood stove. Then came the sounds that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Over the relentless jet engine roar of the wind, she heard the distinct, muffled sound of human panic. A faint scream. The blaring horn of a car alarm abruptly cut short. Another massive structural collapse, this one closer. The ground itself seemed to shudder as a 3-story house simply ceased to exist, folding in on itself under the crushing white weight. Sophia ran to her heavy oak door, throwing the deadbolt. She grabbed the cast-iron handle and pulled. It opened inward, another of Arthur's brilliant, paranoid design choices. If the door had opened outward, she would have been permanently entombed by the snowdrifts packing against the exterior. As the door swung open, a violent torrent of sub-zero air and blinding snow blasted into the entryway, instantly extinguishing 2 of her candles and knocking her backward. She peered out into the maelstrom. The snow had piled nearly 4 feet high against her doorway in just hours. The cold was a physical assault, a biting, feral thing that stole the breath from her lungs. She desperately wanted to step out, to fight her way down the ridge to Marcus's house, to Elias's property, to see who she could save. But she took 1 step into the churning void and was immediately driven to her knees by the sheer velocity of the wind. The snow was blowing horizontally, stinging her face like shards of glass. "Arthur!" she gasped, the wind instantly tearing the name from her lips. She realized with terrifying clarity that she could do nothing. To wander into that whiteout was suicide. The storm owned the night. She had no choice but to retreat. She shoved her weight against the door, battling the pressure vacuum trying to keep it open, and finally managed to click the deadbolt back into place. She collapsed against the wood, shivering violently, her lungs burning. The silence of the cabin rushed back in, heavy with guilt. She was perfectly safe inside her husband's masterpiece. The heavy stones above her were a perfect shield against the wrath of the sky. But she was a prisoner in a warm tomb, forced to listen to the slow, methodical destruction of her community. For the next 4 hours, she sat on the floor with her back against the door, her knees pulled to her chest. She counted the collapses. She heard 5 distinct, catastrophic structural failures echo through the blizzard. Each boom was followed by a sickening crunch of shattering glass and splintering drywall. She knew these houses. She knew the families inside them. They had laughed at her. They had mocked Arthur, destroying his career and accelerating the stress that killed him. But in the dark, trembling by the fire, there was no vindictive triumph in her heart. There was only a profound, devastating sorrow. They had been blind to the changing world, trusting in aesthetics over reality, and the sky was exacting a terrible price for their hubris. As dawn approached, the shrieking wind finally began to lose its pitch. The violent howls dropped into a low, mournful moan. The blizzard was burning itself out. Sofia stood up, her joints stiff and aching. She walked to the window. The sky was shifting from pitch black to a pale, bruised grey. The storm was over. It was time to see what was left of the world. The morning light revealed a landscape that defied comprehension. When Sofia finally managed to dig her way out of her inward swinging door, shoveling through 5 feet of densely packed, concrete-like snow, she stood on her porch and gasped. The picturesque, gentrified mountain town was gone. In its place was an alien, undulating desert of blinding white. The topography of the valley had been violently erased. Where towering, 3-story A-frames had proudly stood the day before, there were now only grotesque, jagged mounds of snow-covered debris. The heavy, wet accumulation had acted exactly as Arthur had predicted. The steep roofs had caught the wind, and the lateral force had snapped the main ridge beams like toothpicks. Roofs had pancaked directly into living rooms. Second floors had crushed first floors. The pristine cedar shingles and expensive panoramic windows were buried beneath tons of splintered lumber and ice. Sofia turned around to look at her own home. The stone shield was entirely intact. Because of its aerodynamic curve, only a thin layer of snow had managed to stick to the top. The rest had been swept off by the wind, creating massive, supportive drifts around the base that actually added to the cabin's thermal insulation. It stood like a grey, unbreakable fortress amidst a sea of devastation. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She grabbed a heavy steel avalanche shovel, an emergency medical kit, and a pair of snowshoes, and began the grueling trek down the ridge. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her snowshoes. It took her 20 minutes of exhausting labor to reach Marcus's property. Where his multi-million-dollar architectural marvel had been, there was only a collapsed, jagged crater of shattered timber. The massive roof had folded entirely down the middle. "Marcus!" Sofia screamed, her voice tearing through the freezing air. "Marcus! Clara!" A faint, muffled thumping responded from beneath the wreckage. Sofia scrambled over the treacherous debris, digging furiously with her shovel. She found a void space where a heavy dining table had caught a falling support beam, creating a small, miraculous pocket of survival. Beneath it, freezing, blooded, and in deep shock, were Marcus and his wife. It took Sofia nearly an hour to clear enough debris to drag them out. Marcus was shivering uncontrollably, his face pale and bruised, his eyes wide with the traumatized vacancy of a man who had seen his entire reality crushed in an instant. He could not speak. He could only stare at the flattened ruins of his wealth. "We have to move," Sofia ordered, pulling his arm over her shoulder. "My cabin, it's warm. Let's go." Over the next 4 hours, Sofia became the lifeline of the ridge. She waded through waist-deep snow, digging out Elias, pulling 2 more families from the ruins of their shattered homes, and leading a slow, agonizing procession of survivors back up the hill. They were battered, weeping, and entirely humbled. When they finally crested the ridge and saw Sofia's cabin standing perfectly whole, the curved stone roof aggressively dominating the sky, they stopped dead in their tracks. The very structure they had relentlessly mocked was now the only sanctuary left in the world. Inside, the cabin was a haven of heat. The stone shield had absorbed the warmth from the wood stove all night, radiating it back into the room. Sofia handed out blankets, poured hot tea, and bandaged cuts. The survivors huddled together on the floor, the arrogance of the previous day completely washed away by the sheer terror of the night. Marcus sat at the dining room table, a blanket wrapped tightly around his trembling shoulders. He stared blankly at the surface of the table. He reached out a shaking, bruised hand and touched the large, unfurled blueprints that Sofia had left out. His eyes, slowly regaining focus, scanned the dense mathematical equations and the intricate architectural drawings. Suddenly, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, his eyes widening in shock. "Sofia," he rasped, his voice raw. These aren't just the plans for your roof." Sofia paused, holding a kettle of hot water. She looked at Marcus, her expression hardened by grief, but devoid of malice. "No," she said softly. "They aren't." Marcus traced a trembling finger across the large, sprawling schematic. It was a map of the entire valley, every property line, every house, every elevation. Arthur hadn't just designed a roof for his own cabin to survive the microclimate shift. He had designed a complete retrofitting protocol for the entire town. The blueprints showed how the stone shield concept could be adapted as modular additions over the existing A-frames, using localized river rock and thermal mass to deflect the wind shear and protect the fragile timber underneath. Arthur had calculated the exact failure points of Marcus's house, Elias's house, the community center. He had mapped the disaster perfectly, and he had drawn the exact cure. "He tried to give these to the town council last year," Sofia said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The survivors on the floor looked up, their faces pale. "He told you the winds were changing. He told you the old roofs would become sails. You laughed at him. You fired him. You called him a fool." Marcus buried his face in his hands, a jagged sob tearing from his chest. The realization crashed over him, heavier than the snow that had destroyed his home. The man they had ruined, the man whose widow they had relentlessly mocked, had spent his final years desperately trying to save their lives. The stone shield above them wasn't a monument to a crazy widow's grief. It was a proven prototype of their only future. The hidden truth was written in the very stones above their heads. Arthur had been right all along. "I'm so sorry," Marcus wept, the proud, arrogant man entirely broken. "My God, Sofia, we were so blind." Sofia walked over and placed a warm hand on his shoulder. "Arthur didn't build this to prove you wrong, Marcus," she said, looking up at the curved, solid ceiling that had held back the fury of the sky. "He built it to keep you safe when you finally realized you needed it. The valley was eventually rebuilt, not with fragile timber pitched arrogantly against the sky, but with the curved, resilient stone shields Arthur had envisioned. Sofia no longer lived as an outcast widow, but as the quiet matriarch who had carried her husband's visionary truth through the harshest winter. True wisdom often looks like madness to those who refuse to see the changing winds, and sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry are exactly what protect us from the storm. If this story of resilience and hidden truth moved you, please hit the like button. Share it with someone who appreciates the strength of the human spirit, and subscribe for more cinematic stories.